Thank you for listening to ClassicalU's podcast, for following us with our courses, training teachers, parents, school leaders on ClassicalU.com. On the podcast, we interview guests that are recording with us, leaders and authors that we're in conversation with related to how to run a great classroom, how to deliver the liberal arts, great books, classical languages to your students. We also have a webinar series, live learning events that is in collaboration with Skole Academy and Skole Communities. Encourage you to watch for those as well. Those are monthly, and we're delighted to have you. Thank you. It is great to have you visiting us all the way from Australia. We have Sarah Flynn here. She's been visiting a number of different companies, organizations across the United States. She's the founder of Logos Australis, and she's a leader and pioneer in classical Christian education in Australia. And she may have some of her own names and terminology for things, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's been really delightful getting to know you and hear some of your story. It's just amazing always to hear of work happening in other places, similar journeys beginning to some of the ones that we've been on with Classical Academic Press and many of our friends at Memoria and other Circe. These relationships and networks are just amazing to see kind of growing and coalescing. So thanks for being with us, and I look forward to chatting.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
We got talking over dinner, actually, about the topic that I asked you if I could pick your brain on a little bit. And it's not something that I'm an expert in. You have some background studying the topic, but it's been a long while. And I'll tell the story, but it's always a little dangerous telling someone else's story, so you'll need to correct me. But as I heard the story that really intrigued me, you had a love for a subject as you were beginning to study it a bit in the course of studying psychology and preparing to be a teacher, teacher training. But you encountered material on Australian Aboriginal culture and some of the values and distinctives in their culture. And it was something that you came to love and have an interest in some time ago in your life. And then more recently, as you've been exploring and taking leadership with and educating people about the classical Christian tradition of education, you were encountering in some of the roots of the Christian faith and of the engagement between, early Christian and Greco-Roman, world. You were encountering some similar things and seeing points of contact, points of comparison. And I just loved hearing what some of those points of contact were and kind of chatting about it. So informally, not as experts or scholars, love to ask you some questions about that. Did I get the story even close to right?
It's pretty close.
Yeah. What would you add? How would you tell your own story?
I actually started out my tertiary study in ecology, environmental studies, and Aboriginal studies. So I majored in both of those things in my undergrad. Okay. And so I spent quite a lot of time on them, and I actually went back when I did my teaching diploma. I majored in Aboriginal studies as a teaching area, which is very rare, but I was quite fascinated with the Indigenous approaches to knowledge, and I was very keen to learn more about it and be able to share that knowledge with people as the opportunity emerged, which it didn't really until much later, perhaps now. And so it was definitely through my journey over the last number of years, uncovering the roots of classical education and particularly the deeper philosophical framing of ideas that are sitting underneath these curriculum changes that think ideas related to ontology, worldview, the way of seeing the universe and understanding who the human being is. That is when some light bulbs started to turn on for me and some connections started to be made with this wonderful understanding I had of how Aboriginal culture operated towards those same things. And so I guess The best way to probably unpack it would be to have a think about why we're doing classical education. Like, what is it that's driven us to look to the past, as we move into the future? What is it about the present culture that is has been so alienating for us, and why is it not working? Because you can talk to any teacher, any parent, any student, probably anyone, and there's aspects of modern Western culture that really don't sit right. And I think there's a lot of people who are realizing that we've taken ways of coping, to the extreme, with consumerism or, substances or other kind of maladaptive behaviours. And certainly in the classroom and through my psychology study, I encountered a lot of that fragmentation, in people as individuals, in families, in communities, in societies. And then I see this beautiful, counter culture emerging in the classical renewal.
Yeah.
And so when we think about these questions of, who is the student?
Yeah.
Who is the human being?
Yeah.
And what is the purpose of education? And we look at what we're presented with in Western contemporary civilization, it's a very, very different thing. That's where the connections were starting to come alive to me. If we consider, the purpose of education, as we talk about in classical education, it's for human flourishing and for, well-being and the transmission of knowledge. Aboriginal culture would say the same thing, I would say. Aboriginal culture has a very integrated view of the world, that we can't separate ourselves from the land. We can't separate this integration of spiritual and scientific understandings of the landscape, and a relational understanding of ourselves to our world and our community. It's very deeply embedded in their worldview, and I do believe that we, as a product of contemporary Western civilization, are grappling with these things because we're trying to reanimate a cosmology and a way of being that we haven't actually received.
Yeah. You sound a little like Andrew Kern when you start talking about cosmology. And, I mean, these are deep and absolutely vital and delightful topics. I have 5 or 6 questions, piling up just as you start sharing.
Yeah.
I want to take one step backward, though, and I didn't really, ask you for the situation in Australia with classical education and, your own company, Logos Australis, and I would love to have you tell the story of how that came about and what who you've met and what's happening in the various sectors in Australia. And then circle back, and I'll then follow up and ask the question, I think I heard a very compelling description just now of some of the ways in which, modern Western culture has alienated us from some fundamental things about our humanity, about integrated relationship with God's, creation. And then how Aboriginal culture, civilization has some of this that's still intact, that they understand in a kind of deeply integrated way. So my question back into classical education will be, where do you see that in the classical Christian tradition? What is some of the terminology that feels like there's parallels or contact points? But first, the story. What's happening in Australia?
Well, I think things are starting to heat up in Australia, which is really exciting. Myself, I discovered classical education probably about 9 years ago, actually, when I had my youngest child, and I wasn't working in schools. I was tutoring some homeschoolers. There's lots of homeschoolers on the coast where we live, and I found that some of them were, following Andrew Kern and Dr. Chris Perrin, and I discovered the great books, and they were great fans of narration. And so I cottoned on to this very, very different atmosphere of learning. Even within the homeschooling community, people who were doing this way of learning had a distinctive flavour. They weren't just doing mainstream education at home. They were doing some other thing. And I got a hold of it. Well, it got a hold of me, I would say. And so here I am. So a couple of years ago, after COVID, I felt the need to take some action. In Australia, we have a low population density and people are spread out. So there's little disparate pockets of people around the coastal areas mainly. And so thanks to the internet, I think there was a lot of people that were having similar experiences. So a lot of people were bringing their children out of school. And so I felt it on my heart to take some action to connect people and make networks. So I didn't have a chance of working in a classical school. So basically I thought that I would just start networking, and I woke up one morning praying and came up with the name Logos Australis, and thought that I would buy a URL site, and that was it. So
the entrepreneur.
I also wanted to get some curriculum into people's hands in Australia at a more affordable rates, because that was a prohibitive. It was prohibitive.
The complications of international shipping and things.
Correct. Yeah. So the conversion rates and shipping. So I bugged CAP for quite some time to give me a distribution deal, and then I went around to other publishers and said, CAP have given me this distribution deal.
The beginning of a business.
It was the beginning, and we started with one book, The Liberal Arts Tradition, and we had some book clubs, and it sold well, and in a very short amount of time, it has gained quite a lot of momentum. I had a few networking meetings. We started out with probably between 10 and 15 interested people in Brisbane.
Wow.
2-3 years ago, to 42 last November. We had a mini conference day and some workshops and speakers and stall holders, and to the 1st of June this year, where we amazingly had Andrew Kern come out on tour. A friend of mine in Melbourne brought him out, also very entrepreneuring.
So these homeschool students who were just eating up Andrew Kern got to spend time with him.
Yeah, and I think it was very exciting to see that there was this kind of latent understanding and knowing and desire, and people knew who Andrew Kern was. And they came out of the woodwork. And so we had a conference with over 110 people, and we hosted a dinner in the evening, and people had come in from all over Australia, actually, to be a part of that. And it was a great sense of community and excitement. And we used the analogy of, it's very difficult when you are pioneering. If I could use a ecology an analogy, the pioneer species, they have to hit hard dirt. There's not a lot. There's not a lot of nutrient in the soil. It's very barren and hostile. But they have to dig in and commit, and then over time, other species come along and change that environment. And so I think it is very difficult for people at the outset to feel hope and, that there is, to even be able to identify where a way forward is. I think that's certainly been a big challenge for people who are having these conversations, who classical education has grabbed them. But then what do we do now? Which part of the puzzle do we work on? So there's some people that are establishing schools. There's some people that are establishing homeschooling co-ops. There's some people like myself and ACEs in Melbourne who are promoting and networking and hosting events and, thinking more strategically about things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds a lot like the United States, 20 some years ago. It's exciting and very difficult. I love that analogy, going back to your ecological roots and the species that get started when there's no soil.
That's right.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I want to jump back into the ecology question and your original love by coming back to, so you described the anthropology and the connectedness to place in Aboriginal culture and how deeply ingrained that is, and the passing on of these things. There's a kind of tradition, a sense of tradition there, it sounds like. And I'm already beginning to, very easily make contact in my mind with classical Christian insights into anthropology and who we are. But how would you, coming from the kind of vocabulary of the classical Christian tradition, where do you see the points of contact and overlap?
I think what really started to turn on the light bulbs for me was reading Kevin Clark and Robbie Jane's liberal arts tradition. And there are a few parts of that text that really spoke to me. And probably one of the main ones, and this is something that I see in terms of starting schools, and one of the questions that people who are starting schools ask or have experienced is we start out with the best intentions, but how do we stop teachers and all of us from defaulting back to what we know and what we're really familiar with? And in that book, there's the opening section on piety, and if you look into that, the ideas underneath that, it's this idea of a faithfulness to God and to your family and to your community. And from a psychological language, we would kind of look at that as a collectivist elements of what we call collectivist cultures. So traditional cultures and maybe Asian or cultures have more of an understanding of their own identity in terms of where they sit within the group and society. And that is what I could see in the Greco-Roman and early Western civilization. And that is a very strong element in Aboriginal culture. And so I think that we of the modern West are hyper-individual. We can live next door to people for 15 years and never even know who they are or engage in a relationship. And, we've got some East Timor people in our church that come over to work, and they're really shocked by it. It hurts them to see that the way that, Westerners kind of don't interact with each other and they don't share their lives. And I think this is a really fundamental question and a fundamental challenge for the classical renewal is how do we do life together in community, in piety towards God, and how do we live a faithful life? And I think not only our relationship to God and family and society, but also our land comes into that, because when we continued through the book study, I know that they have written another book on the new natural philosophy.
Yeah.
So I haven't completed studying properly.
Ravi specifically with a team of 2 other authors.
Yeah. So I'd be really interested to kind of...
Yeah, with your ecology and science background.
Tap into that. That's right. Properly. But what I saw within the liberal arts tradition was this completely different approach to the land and the created universe that we have completely left behind. And so, I guess it's the post-Enlightenment worldview is that the whole of reality is, the whole of creation is a bunch of material atoms, you know, that just clump together in some random miracle to produce life as we know it. And I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where Eustace meets I can't remember his name. Ramandu, the star. Yes. And he says, "You're not a star. The star is a bunch of, gas and dust." And Ramandu says, Do you remember?
That's only what a star is made of, not what a star is.
Yes, that's right. And I think that's quite Aristotelian ideas there. So, what is the substance? And this really is at the core of Indigenous view of the world, of creation, of the created world and the relationship. And I think there's a really deep yearning in a lot of people's souls to reconnect with that understanding of creation.
Yeah.
But we have done a terrible job. We don't know probably really where to start.
Yeah. When you lose something as a whole culture or community, it's more than an individual loss. The solutions are not simple. And we some of the solutions are simple, not to be too bleak. I do think that countercultural in the stories surrounding classical Christian, community schools, hybrid schools, co-ops in America, I often hear people say that just coming together and trying to do something very real, like caring for each other's children together, is countercultural.
Yes.
So, and just the simple facts of, the people in your church who were kind of feeling, wow, there's this sort of impoverishment to, modern Western life where we don't share these kinds of tasks together, like raising children. Someone once told me that, you can tell which families in a particular neighborhood go to the classical Christian school because there are piles of bicycles at their front yards. The kids actually spend time together after school, and as some of that is lost increasingly, that sense of living together, it's happening in classical Christian schools. And it is, I think it is, it's more than just doing something countercultural and real together. There are the metaphysical and theological roots that are also being reactivated and rediscovered by people together of what is a real Christian anthropology and a real Christian cosmology, and how do we relate to God's creation as, in some sense, a living, full of life. And so, what are some other ways, resources? I think, poetic knowledge, the idea that God's creation is a patterned creation. What are other ways of talking about these points of contact between kind of pre-modern human wisdom and what's being rediscovered in the classical Christian tradition?
Yeah, I think another one that springs to mind is the role of story in transmitting knowledge. So, the mythology is the main mechanism, and oral history, and the very huge importance of memory. And imagine, the use of imagination and experiential learning. So I think there's a lot of contact there with the classical renewal. The loss of myth is front and center to our foundation, the great books, and how they order the loves and order a moral character and impart that into children without needing it to be, explicit all the time and just something that they're told about. It's inculcated in this wonderful, wonder-filled world and in a joyful way. So, it was a conversation I actually started with Katarina Hamilton, that this point of contact around that she had come to be aware of, because I think she's done a lot of work on the memory and the memory palace and that sort of stuff through. And so she knew about Indigenous approaches to, encoding memory.
Yeah.
And she had heard of the Aboriginal songlines.
Can you describe that? Yeah.
Well, songlines is something that I don't have a huge authority to speak on, but I can just briefly describe it. It would be this idea that it's a geographical and ecological knowledge primarily, but also a spiritual and cultural knowledge. And so songlines occur across a landscape, and there's my understanding, within different Aboriginal nations, elders and people who are coming into initiation have the knowledge of the songs and the dances imparted to them through sacred processes, liturgical, if you like, processes that bring them into an understanding of the landscape as a spiritual and ecological entity. So on a practical level, people were able to survive in the landscape by being able to read it and understand the relationships between, the seasons and the fauna and the flora. When a certain tree is in flower, that's when we were able to harvest, certain crabs or species for food. Yeah. So there would be a physical movement across the landscape throughout the year, and that would be the songline. So different particular places across the landscape represented certain song and dance and story. Yeah. And so there was an imagined landscape. There was a mapping. And so what you see often in Aboriginal art is it looks quite abstract to the Western eye, but it's quite often these kind of aerial maps, actually, of country. So it's a very precious thing. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a connection to the memory palace that Katerina was recognizing.
Yes, I think so, yes.
That sort of imagined landscape that informs you at multiple levels regarding your physical landscape and how to live with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, from a psychological education point of view, I would love the opportunity to, dive into this in research a bit more one day, but the encoding of memory and the retention of memory and engagement is like this huge thing that teachers are concerned about, because we can present information to kids and they 5 seconds later they don't retain it anymore.
Just cram for one test after another.
Cram, that's right. Yeah. And I when information is shared as experiential, or this imagined experience even, it's compelling. It's animated landscape with relationships and events that happen, and so I suspect that it's a much more rigorous way to encode learning. Yeah.
It's something that's going to last.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I can see the connections to the liberal arts tradition with Kevin Clark and Ravi Jain as well. Continuing to show up. The music and gymnastics is so you started with piety, but the contact points just keep going. Yeah. What are some of the hopes for your own nation? Is there anything you can speak to of what you might dream of being involved with, or this feels to me like it informs and kind of enriches and confirms things that classical Christian educators here in the United States are only, frankly, learning to even talk about and sort of figure out what have we stumbled into here. It's not any great claim to accomplishment. It's a kind of delight in something that we're barely able to articulate. So I always love these feedback loops where I'm hearing something confirmed and enriched, and it gives me ideas for small things that we could try to deepen or apply in classical Christian education here in the United States. But are there any ideas or dreams along those lines in your own context?
Well, I think in the Australian context, as in the American, civic discourse has become incredibly polarized and unnecessarily so. And I think there's a real loss of, obviously we're not educated to learn to know how to discuss things in a logical manner anymore. And what I can see in these connections is the potential, particularly for the realm of Indigenous issues and challenges in our country, which is just so polarized. That we could potentially have the opportunity to reframe some of those conversations in a less adversarial way. And when I hear there's many Aboriginal leaders and voices, probably more on the conservative side, but on the traditional side as well, who, want to see two ways come together. We walk together, that's their feeling, that's their language. Sometimes we walk apart and sometimes we walk together. Unfortunately, the way the narrative has gone in Australia is that I think both sides of the political debate are a little bit too caught up in their side of the argument to see the value in both sides of those conversations. And so I think on the left, yes, there has been injustice, and we do crave, some kind of, healing and reconnection, and but we don't want it to be, I don't know that, as much as I don't really want to get into politics, it's a little bit unavoidable, really, on this topic. And I think that a lot of the issues with, in my understanding, the issues with, Indigenous engagement with education is a really big problem in Australia. Aboriginal people have viewed the mainstream education system as something that will divest their young people of their tradition and their culture. And so it's a hostile proposition. If we look at education through classical education, paradigm, it's not the same hostility. It's not the same mismatch of values and worldviews. So, I see a way forward, not only for classical education, but for, potentially Indigenous people and the Indigenous voice and the Indigenous identity to feed into the greater Australian identity. And wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? And that is really what people want in our hearts.
So there's something there that we need, and we have you're describing an opportunity. If sort of Western culture could recognize that it has something at its roots, that it's lost and been fragmented from, that in the Australian context, Aboriginal culture could help it to rediscover, to re-educate, reteach, reform, the broader culture. And it's also reaffirming, right, in the other direction of insofar as there's walking together, there would be affirmation of so much that's valued and cherished.
I think we've lacked creativity in our thinking.
How to frame it.
I think it's just these insurmountable problems for the common good, of all Australians, and it's been a very adversarial narrative, and then you just don't get any progress at all. In fact, things go backwards, and I think that's what we have seen in Australia.
Well, there's certainly parallels. Some, the polarization and things like that are very close parallels, between. But some of the particulars are vary. But it's encouraging and instructive to hear, to hear your story and your insights, because we're up against some similar challenges as well. So certainly in the United States, and even 20-some years in to classical Christian renewal, it only feels like baby steps in some regards. For sure. What would be in your own life, ways that you've found, connection, reintegration, a kind of a little bit of relief from the fragmentation that classical Christian teaching and reading has kind of brought to you. Have you? What about the Christian classical tradition has awakened and allowed you to see a way to kind of reintegrate any aspects of your own life?
That is a very good question. I don't think I have been asked that before.
It's a very personal question.
Yeah, it is very personal. Look, I have really enjoyed beginning to read some of the great books with my children, who haven't really had the benefit of a classical education. Most of them are sort of grown up or late teens. And I think just the wonder of fiction stories and philosophical ideas around the kitchen table. We did always read out loud to some extent, and we were always Tolkien fans and Lewis Narnia fans. But for example, my daughters, we've been commonplacing this year, and I've got 3 older daughters who've been at home, and I was trying to find a way into, these philosophical texts, because it's not their culture to have read Plato, and it's not actually that easy.
For sure.
So we started with The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, and to see the fruit actually of them drawing these beautiful pictures and writing the poetry and analysing some of the philosophical ideas. And, in my searching through psychology, this idea of flourishing and well-being, that is at the core of classical education. And so to me, that was something, it's like coming onto a highway after hacking through the jungle, for your whole life, being able to access it. That's
another great image.
Yeah, so I think
images are often connected to the land.
That's right. So I think that is that's probably the great gift that I'm beginning to see, and my children are taking it up. It's a little bit late in the story, but that's okay, because my eldest is doing primary teaching, and she's doing a great books course and has been studying romantic poetry, and sent me her, analysis, while we've been away. And my other daughter is going to go and do liberal arts at our only college, Campion College. So that is a great reassurance to me, that it takes root.
Yes, that's great. Thank you for sharing a little of the personal story. So we do have a very short mini course telling the story in a little more detail with your work in Australia and the various other folks networking there. Interview, just a sort of interview format with Dr. Chris Perrin. So I hope people who are interested in hearing more about the story of what's going on in Australia can check that out. What else would you point people to as far as resources and opportunities?
In Australia?
Your own audience, or just books you love that either your own audience or a broader audience, either way.
I think I've grown a lot from a lot of the, baseline core reading that, Dr. Perrin and ClassicalU put together. So I think if anyone was wanting to get started, poetic knowledge for me is a pretty important part of the puzzle. Unpacking how the worldview has changed.
And the book by that title?
The book by that title, Poetic Knowledge by James S. Taylor, I would highly recommend. And obviously, The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, which, identifies in a different way the loss of the importance of objective truth from our way of understanding things. Yeah, so I think, and there's a few small businesses. You want me to do a plug?
Yeah, please do.
In Australia, we have the Australian Classical Education Society that is sort of centred in Melbourne, and they're doing a lot of wonderful work in bringing people together and communicating and introducing, some key people from America and also within Australia. We have some classical schools starting up, and a friend of mine has an online academy called Via Classica, and she's been able to, meet some of the demand in the homeschooling market. It's been tough establishing these businesses. There's several other small classical Christian schools that are starting in Australia, and if people wanted to reach out and find out about them, I'm happy to be a point of contact and pass on information.
And people can find you at
logosaustralis.com.
Very good.
Yeah, and my email is contact@logosaustralis.com.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. It's been a delight to chat, and really appreciate you taking the extra time. Wasn't, announced or planned, but just jumping in. So thanks so much, Sarah.
Very honored to be here, and so thank you for welcoming me.
You've been listening to ClassicalU's podcast. Thank you for tuning in. We release podcast episodes once a month with our presenters. Please also check out our live learning events, webinars in collaboration with Skole Academy and Skole Communities.